Thank you very much, Gilbert. It's great to be here. I have lots of friends who live in Stellenbosch, and my company published Professor Sampie Teblanche's what we think is now a classic, A History of Inequality in South Africa, 1652 to 2002. And Sampie has done a follow-up to this book, which we are publishing in a couple of months' time. Am I the one who switched off the lights, or you switched them off? So it's great for me to be at Stellenbosch, but I must say I'm very impressed that you folks who are the students are up so early. When I was a student, I can't imagine when I would have gotten up so early to come and listen to some unknown character. Those days we spent most of the time debating about everything: capitalism, socialism, communism, feminism, as well as demonstrating against the Americans in Vietnam, against the apartheid system, against Ian Smith, against Pinochet in Chile. I hope that now I'm getting worried whether you demonstrate against anybody if you can get up so early. We drank a lot of beer as well. So I can see that South African brewery hasn't got good clients in you if you can get up so early. Now, on the issue that I've been asked to come and talk about, I published these two books. One came out in 2009, The Architects of Poverty, which was really trying to identify what are the problems that South Africa and Africa is faced with. I have been fortunate in that I lived beside South Africa. I lived in Lesotho, I lived in the UK, in the United States, in Tanzania, in Zimbabwe, and in Kenya, and in Zambia. So I've lived in a number of countries. The one thing I always say I have to thank the National Party for is forcing some of us to exile, because when we were in exile, we were able to acquire a lot of experiences, which obviously the National Party had hoped we wouldn't acquire, but anyway, we did. And we learned a lot about the big wide world, and especially about other African countries. So for this, I have Dr. Vervoet to thank for his... I understand he was a graduate of this place also. So talk of a villain now. That is a villain for you. Anyway, I have to thank Vervoet for that. He was, at the time when I went to exile, I think he was Minister of Native Affairs, so I was one of his real subjects, being a native. Anyhow, the challenge really that we're faced with in South Africa is the challenge of development. And the challenge of development the real challenge is that we are sitting with between half and 75% of our population living in poverty. And that is the primary challenge that this country is faced with. I think we do have a secondary challenge, which is to protect the democracy that the people of South Africa fought for and won in the 90s. There are lots of challenges to that democracy, especially by the ruling party. So that is a secondary challenge. But the primary challenge that we're faced with, which is what I'm going to talk about, is the issue of development. How do we move our economy in such a way that we don't have half or three-quarters of our population living in poverty? Now, there are two reasons that you have to do this. It could be from the goodness of your heart, that you don't like to see people living in poverty. But most importantly, of course, is that there will never be stability in South Africa as long as we are sitting with 36% unemployment, with half to three-quarters of our population living in poverty. So and this has enormous consequences for South Africa, because it creates an environment of uncertainty, which means that even the rich South Africans don't feel secure. And one of the consequences of this is emigration of skilled people from South Africa, and the other consequence is capital flight, the movement of huge amounts of capital from South Africa to outside South Africa, because the people who own this capital feel insecure, and so you are faced with this problem. So a country with huge poverty gets trapped in a downward spiral of continuing poverty. And I don't think any of us want this to happen in South Africa. Now, I've prepared a very brief, schematic, really, explanation of what has happened to South Africa during the last 100 years. I don't know if this thing is going to work. Where are you, sir? Which one am I using? Am I using the wrong one? Is it going? Oh, maybe. Shall we move it here from here? Yeah, there you go. Okay, what I think, what we are trying to show in these books is how South Africa works, how it developed to where it is today, and what is happening to the economy of South Africa today. And what I think the world what we all now understand, I think, as social scientists, is that the driver of development in a country, it is the people who control the political power. Many people think that the driver of development are the industrialists who own the factory, who own the farm, who own the productive assets of the country. But the first primary driver of development are the political elite who control the politics of the country. If the political elite that control the politics is not interested in modernization of a country, is not interested in the industrialization of the country, it has the power to stop industrialization. It has the power to stop the potential entrepreneurs. One of the classic illustrations of this is the experience of Japan. In the 16th century, Japan was exposed to Western traders and to Western influence, to Western religions. But the problem with the Western influence on Japan was that, and especially the development of Catholicism, was that it threatened the power of the samurai and the power of the aristocracy in Japan, because Christianity made the Japanese independent of the traditional control and ideological and religious systems of the ruling elite in Japan. So sometime at the beginning of the 17th century, the Japanese elite destroyed all semblance, or first they destroyed all the converts. Hundreds of thousands of people who had converted to Christianity were killed. The gun was banned in Japan because it threatened the power of the samurai, who were part of the ruling class who controlled the population. Western technology was banned, and trade with Western countries was also banned. And so Japan remained a feudal society for the next 250 years, and it was only in the late 19th century when the Western powers forced open Japan to trade with them that the Japanese realized that they need to industrialize the country in order to be able to resist the impositions from the Western powers. So it is the political elite that controls the political power that determines whether a country develops or not. Now, if we look at South Africa, and I'm only looking at South Africa since 1910, we can go further back, right up to the beginning of the modern era, but I thought I should just deal with South Africa now. Now, if you see who has been controlling power in South Africa in the post-British colonial era, we have had two types of elites in South Africa. We have the property-owning elite, which took power from the British, mainly the generals from the Boer War. And these were the Boer generals who took over power from the British in 1910, Smuts, Louis Botha, De Wet, and so on and so forth. So this is the group that I call a westernized property-owning elite that took over power. Now, what does it use? If you are a property owner, you use the power of the state in order to make your property more profitable. And this is exactly what happened between 1910 and 1994. Is this elite, this political elite, use their control of the state in order to turn South African agriculture from what it was, especially in the interior, which was a very backward agriculture, to transform that agriculture into a profitable agriculture, to grow the maize triangle in particular. So that is how they use their political power to develop their assets. Now, the resources that they used were government revenues, were loans, were foreign aid, and private savings. This is, if you look at South Africa in 1910, for example, the first institution that was built in South Africa in 1910 was the Land Bank, precisely in order to finance, to use state resources to finance the development and the modernization of South Africa's commercial agriculture. One of the interesting things is that the first bank to collapse after the ANC came into power was the Land Bank. So it tells you something about the difference between these two elites that have been ruling South Africa. The other one, as you can see, was very much investment-oriented. Now, from 1994, you get an equally westernized leadership, but it does not own property. So what is then is its driving force? Its driving force, obviously, is not to develop its assets because it hasn't got any. Its primary objective is to develop its own consumption. So if you look at what has been happening to the South African economy in the past, since 1994, the South African economy has become a consumption-oriented economy, whereas prior to 1994, South Africa was very much an investment-oriented economy. Today, for example, by 1990, South Africa had one of the largest railway networks. We had about 22,000 kilometers of railway, which was operating, which was operational. And 80%, for example, of the grain, of the maize and wheat that moved in South Africa moved on the railways because that's the cheap means of transport for bulk, low-value products. Today, only 20% of the grain moves on railways. The rest moves on roads because the people who control the railway infrastructure of South Africa today are not made. They use it as a form of taxation, a form of enrichment for the new elite rather than what it should be used for. Now, if we look at the type of society that we have created, this is the social structure of South Africa in the post-1994 era. We can do something similar about what South Africa was like before 1994, what its social structure was like, but I don't think it serves any purpose. But if you look at what the social structure of South Africa looks like today, okay, I think this thing is operating. If you look at our social system, we have primarily 5 social groups in our country. And these groups interact with each other in a very, very important way, which is what determines the political stability of South Africa, the social stability of South Africa, and virtually everything about South Africa is actually determined by the social structure. There are, of course, outside players who are very critical to the well-being of South Africa, but I'm not going to go into that. I pointed out that the political elite are the ones that determine whether a country develops or not. This is the political elite of South Africa. Oh, we got this backward. No, this is the political elite of South Africa. If you look at the economic elite, one of the interesting things about what happened in 1994 was that there was a separation between the political elite and the economic elite. Prior to 1994, there was no real separation between the political elite and the economic elite. The National Party represented the capitalists as well as the political elite at the time. So there was that sort of an alliance. There were areas of disagreement, like over apartheid, job reservation, and so on. But essentially, the National Party was itself a party of the economic elite. As I pointed out, it was founded by the generals from the Anglo-Boer War days, who were the major landowners in this country. Now, if you look at the economic elite today in South Africa, their objective is obviously to maximize their profit and to retain ownership of their assets. Their strength is that they have these productive assets, but most importantly, they control the highest skilled part of our population, which is the management of our economic system. The accountants, the engineers, the bankers, the managers. Most of the intellectual power of South Africa resides with the economic elite. It does not reside with the political elite. But they do have weakness in the sense that they don't control the government and they are dependent on the state for electric power and for transportation in particular. So for a country like South Africa, where most of our endowment is in the interior of the country in the form of our minerals and in the form of our major grain producing areas, you can see the importance of who controls transport. Who controls transport controls a lot of power in this country. This group has, most importantly, its own vulnerabilities. Its assets could be seized, it is exposed to onerous taxation, and it is exposed to corruption by the political elite. The consequence of that vulnerability is what I explained earlier, which is why we have huge amount of capital flight from South Africa. Because if the owners of the economy, if the owners of our productive assets feel uncertain, feel vulnerable, then they have to diversify where they keep their money. Wits University has been running a program looking at capital flight from South Africa. And they estimate that in 2007 alone, South Africa lost $20 billion through illegal capital exports from South Africa, mainly through transfer pricing between companies inside the country and their clients outside the country. Since 1994, in fact, capital flight on average has been growing, getting higher and higher and higher in South Africa. The interesting thing is when South Africa was actually most unstable, which was in the last 2 decades of the National Party regime, there was very little capital flight out of South Africa. But since 1994, there has been a huge amount of capital flight. Up to 20% of South Africa's gross domestic product flies out of the country almost annually. And that is the consequence of that vulnerability. Now, if you look at the political elite, the new political elite in South Africa, I've called them a bureaucratic bourgeoisie. They have a lifestyle of a bourgeoisie like the capitalists, but they don't own the assets. But they have the lifestyle. They get this lifestyle from the salaries that they pay themselves, from government revenues, and from parastatals, and a little bit extra from corruption. So this is what. In fact, South Africa, in 1995, I think we were rated number 34. There's a whole hierarchy of who's more corrupt than whom. The least corrupt is rated 1, which I think is Norway. The most corrupt, I think, is Pakistan or somewhere like that. Is number 180. In 1994, South Africa was number 35. Today, we're number 66. So we are chasing Pakistan and Nigeria and all the others. So anyway, if you look at the political elite in South Africa today, their main objective, since they are not owners of assets, their main objective is to maximize their consumption. But it is also to maximize the consumption of who votes for them, who keeps them in power. And the people who keep this group in power in terms of our electoral system, it is the poor. 70% of the voters for the ANC do not work. So that a very small part of the voters for the ANC are actually the people who are working. Many of my friends in COSATU think that they put the ANC in power. Actually, it's not them who put the ANC in power. It's the poor who are not working who put the ANC in power, which is why the ANC always ignores COSATU, although COSATU feels they have this alliance which should be listened to, but nobody listens to it. The main strength, of course, of this group is that they control the state and they manage government revenues. I'm sure you heard that this year, this financial year, South Africa's government revenues are going to go past the R1 trillion mark. So government revenues in South Africa are a huge amount of money. Now, for people who own nothing, to control so much money is a massive temptation. And I'm sure all of us would be tempted if we were in that position. They do have their weakness, though. They depend on the underclass for their vote. They don't own productive assets, and they have very poor management skills compared to the economic elite. And the manifestation of these poor management skills are what we call service delivery demonstrations. The service delivery demonstrations are, in fact, a manifestation of the lack of skills of the political elite to manage the local authority, to manage the education system, to manage the hospitals, to manage the water system, and so on and so forth. So that is where the service delivery comes from. And their vulnerability is the change of allegiance of the underclass. If the underclass changes its allegiance and starts to support somebody else, then you have a huge problem for that group politically, which is very important, because if we look at organized labor, which are the formal sector operators, mainly the trade unions, South Africa is probably one of the most unionized countries in the world in terms of formal sector work. The percentage of formal sector workers who are members of the trade unions. If you take all our trade unions, COSATU, NACTU, FEDUSA, Solidarity, all that, more than 50% of formal sector employees belong to trade unions in South Africa, which is, so the organized labor is an important player. Its objective is, of course, to raise their wages and to expand their membership. They control labor power and the trade unions, but they are faced with a threat from the overhang of the unemployed, which is a huge sector of our society. Their vulnerability is mismanagement of the economy, corruption, and loss of influence with the government. And you can begin to see what is happening, that this group, the economic elite and organized labor, are faced with the same common threat. Corruption being a very important threat to both the capitalists in this country as well as to organized labor. Mismanagement of the economy, of the rand, of the currency, of the transport system, and so on, is also a threat to this group. Now, what this means is that in terms of potential political power in South Africa, you have a common interest between the economic elite and organized labor. You have a common threat to them, and they have a common interest. And this is one of the biggest threats to the political elite today, is the possibility of organized labor and organized business getting together to form a new counter-political elite to them, and therefore to take the allegiance of the underclass from the existing leadership to a new political party. So what we are seeing in South Africa is a potential emergence of a new political party, which is driven by organized labor and by business. In my view, I think that will be a good thing for South Africa. It will diversify South Africa's political system. It will strengthen the democracy in South Africa. So I don't see that, of course, for the people in power today, they see that as a major, major threat, that potential eventuality. Now, South Africa has the largest voting constituency, as I pointed out in South Africa, is what I call the underclass, which are the poor. And since 1996, this group has been a huge part of state revenue is being transferred to subsidize this group. And of course, the quid pro quo is that they vote for the people in power who are transferring these resources to them. I think I have, let me just check, just to show you what is happening to this is an illustration of what has been happening to recipients of social grants in South Africa since 1996. You can see that today, in 1996, we had just about 2 million recipients of social grants. Today is over 15 million recipients of social grants in this country. This is up to 2009, but in the current financial year, it's 15.5 million people receive social grants in this country. And this is, but the payback for this is voting for whoever is giving them that money. Now, South Africa, one of the things that distinguishes South Africa from the rest of Africa is this. If we were talking about the rest of Africa, in the rest of Africa, this group here would have been the peasantry. If you look at Tanzania, if you look at Kenya, if you look at Ethiopia, Nigeria, you would have had a big peasant social group. South Africa does not have a peasantry. The peasantry in this country was destroyed by the mining industry starting in the 1880s because it wanted migrant labor, so it destroyed peasant agriculture. In its place, we have an interesting group in South Africa, which is a very large independent professionals group, independent entrepreneurs, what is generally called civil society. But the civil society group is also more aligned with the organized labor. It also helps that through the non-governmental organizations. So you can see when you look at the social structure that the threat to the power of the political elite today comes from the three groups. It comes from this independent civil society, it comes from the capitalists, and it comes from organized labor. And there is a response that is now being put in place by the people who control the state, which is to start to tackle the issue of the independence of all these groups by trying to undermine the independence of the media, by trying to control the judiciary. You have seen how Jacob Zuma, since he came into power, has been trying to gain control of the Constitutional Court by placing the famous Mogoeng, or infamous, I'm not sure which, who nobody knows who this guy is, what he does. All we know is that Mogoeng, when he was working for the Bob government, he was so enthusiastic. He was a prosecutor there, and he was a great supporter of the death sentence. Now he's Chief Justice of a country that doesn't have a death sentence. So this is what is happening. The independence of the judiciary is being threatened because this group feels very, very threatened by what is emerging in the country. The independence of the media is under threat. The state has long taken control of SABC, which is supposed to be an independent public broadcaster, but is actually run as if it's a branch of the ANC. So there are a great many manifestations at the political level that this structure has thrown up. But at the economic level, the way the structure plays itself out is that it transfers resources to consumption rather than to investment. If you compare the consumer spending, private consumer spending, as percentage of GDP in the BRIC countries, which we are a member of, South Africa, this is percentage of GDP that goes to consumer spending. You can see that South Africa, this is 1990, consumer spending has been spiraling upwards. And if you compare it with China, this is China, from 1990, consumer spending as percentage of GDP in China has been spiraling downwards. The difference between us and China, 45% of China's GDP goes into investment, which is why 400 million Chinese in the last 25 years have come out of poverty, whereas in South Africa, our poverty is getting more and more. We are transferring a huge amount. In fact, according to Investec, today, 72% of our GDP goes into private consumption, compared to 35% in the case of China. And of course, our investment, China's investment as percentage of GDP is around 45%. South Africa's investment, gross fixed capital formation as a percentage of GDP is 18%. which means that we are really just about maintaining what we have. We are not creating new capital, new investment, which is why we have massive unemployment problem in this country. If you look at how the South African GDP is spent and you compare it to that of China, this shows very clearly where we are. Private consumption in South Africa is way up there. Private consumption in China is going down. Private consumption is being replaced or overtaken by gross fixed capital formation, whereas gross fixed capital formation in South Africa, you can see what it's doing today, as I point out. It's less than 20%, it's 18%. But what is growing is government consumption. And you can see government consumption in China is not, in fact, growing. It has been level since 1978, whereas our government consumption is more than 20%. In fact, today, state revenues sit at 33% of GDP. Now, the consequence of all this unemployment is very, very clear in the case of South Africa. If you compare formal sector employment in South Africa and compare it to other middle-income countries which are like us, you can see this is from 1980. Formal sector employment in the middle-income countries has been growing and growing. These are countries like some of countries in South America, some countries in Eastern Europe. But if you look at formal sector employment in South Africa, it was growing, and the rate of growth started to decline. By the late 1980s, it's been going down. There was a brief growth there, but when you analyze the growth that happened between 2001 and 2008, most of that growth was the increase in security guards. In our statistics, it calls it business services. So Statistics SA will say there was huge growth in employment in the business services, but when you look closer, they are actually security guards. And why do we need so many security guards in this country? It's because of this trend in our employment levels. People are more and more, unemployment is growing, people are getting poorer. The social welfare program is not stopping the insecurity that goes with the poverty. Yes, it keeps the poor kind of with heads just above water, but it doesn't solve the problems of social cohesion and all the other problems that we know South Africa suffers from. So this is how a social structure like ours, this is the consequences that it produces. It produces a stagnant economy, which is what the South African economy is. It's treading water, it's not investing, it's losing a lot of capital, it's becoming more and more unstable because the poor are themselves now. Not only is it becoming, the inequality in South Africa is actually growing. We have seen that, and these are some of the major drivers of political instability, is growing inequality. The Gini coefficient of South Africa is closer to 7 compared to China's, which is closer to 3. So you're getting massive inequality, and with this inequality, there is a sense of injustice amongst the people who are being left out of benefits from the change that has been happening. One of the striking things about South Africa is, of course, if you don't invest, then your industry collapses, because if you cannot invest, then you cannot compete. And one of the most interesting illustration of the deindustrialization of South Africa is our footwear industry. South Africa used to have a very strong footwear industry. Today, our footwear industry is virtually non-existent. I don't know if that is clear enough, but this line shows, the blue line shows how many pairs of shoes are made in South Africa. In 1991, South Africa made over 80 million pairs of shoes. By 2005, we made just over 20 million pairs of shoes. And instead, we were importing 20 million pairs of shoes in 1991. By 2005, we're importing 160 million pairs of shoes. If you look at the shoe that you are wearing today, the chances are that it is imported. So all the footwear that's worn in this room, I can bet you that 99% of the footwear we are all wearing is imported and not made in South Africa. Now, the Western Cape used to be one of the major producers of footwear. The Midlands, the Natal Midlands, used to be another center of production of footwear. And there's a book which was published, I think, last year by a Wits professor who studied what has happened to the families that used to make shoes in the Natal Midlands, the huge poverty that has engulfed that population. And really, all it is because of these imports and because of lack of investment. I visited recently one of the companies that survives in the Midlands, and I was asking them how did they manage to survive. Essentially, they put in a whole new management and a whole new technology in order to be able to compete against the Chinese. And today they say they are able to compete against the Chinese because they can deliver shoes to Foschini quicker than what the Chinese can do. Even though our costs are still slightly higher, but because of the delivery time, because of the reorganization of the management and the increase in productivity, they are able to compete against the Chinese. However, but if you look at the industry as a whole, this is what you see that has been going on. And you can look at many other sectors of the South African economy, and you will see that trend. The other day, I was told by the Argentine ambassador that South Africa imports 1.2 million tons of soybean cake to feed the cattle. We're importing from Argentina, Brazil, and the United States 1.2 million tons. Why aren't we growing soya? Because all the regions in South America that are producing soya are in the same latitude as South Africa. So South Africa is capable of producing soya, but because we have stopped investing while the countries like Brazil are increasing their agricultural research, are increasing investment in agriculture, in infrastructure, and so on. One of the things which amused me, I sent an SMS to Nazir Ali, the current villain in terms of the e-tolls, and sympathizing with him being forced out of his job. Nazir is an old friend of mine. We were students together. And so I said I have to buy him a drink to console him. And he told me he's in Brazil teaching procurement to the Brazilians. So which was quite a surprise to me that, so we have highly skilled people like Nazir Ali, but we don't value them ourselves. But the Brazilians value Nazir, and so they bring him over to come and show them how to develop their infrastructure, how to develop their road and their rail system. Just to illustrate proportionately what has happened to the footwear industry and to the employment in the footwear industry, you can see that in 1985, 78% of all footwear sold in South Africa was made in South Africa, and only 22% was imported. By 2005, local production had declined to about 17% of consumption, and 83% of the footwear that was used in South Africa was imported. And in terms of employment, these are the figures which I got from the South African Footwear and Leather Industries Association. So they are not from Stats SA, which may or may not have been cooked. So these are figures from the industrialists themselves, and you can see the consequences of what lack of investment does. In 1995, we employed nearly 24,000 people in the footwear industry. By 2006, this had dropped down to less than half of what the labor force that was there. So in conclusion, I think the point that we are trying to make in those books is that South Africa does need we need to relook at our social structure. We need to relook at our politics. We need to redesign, in a way, our economic policies. If we don't do that, South Africa is really heading for trouble. And that is what is becoming clearer and clearer, not just to the South Africans themselves, to many investors who, from outside. Most of the money that comes into South Africa, government is always boasting about attracting investment. Actually, the money that comes into South Africa is hot money that gets into government bonds. It gets into the Joburg Stock Exchange, but it can leave just as readily as quickly as it came in. So there is a real need to rethink the South African model, and I think this is the challenge that is faced by all of us, as what do we do in order to implement a second new South Africa. One of the interesting things about the papers that the ANC has produced, they've come up with an interesting term which is called the second transformation. So the ANC leadership says we need a second transformation, but what they don't point out is that actually the second transformation is to get rid of them. And that's what the second transformation will do to the ANC. Thank you very much. Thank you.